The ANC has welcomed the declaration of a state of disaster over the energy crisis. President Cyril Ramaphosa made the announcement during his State of Nation address last night. Ramaphosa will also appoint a Minister of Electricity in the Presidency who will focus on overseeing all aspects of the electricity crisis response. The party says this is the right step towards solving Eskom's challenges. South Africans have been battling various stages of load shedding on a daily basis. Well, for more analysis, we are joined by Economist Michelle Austin. Michelle, very good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Now, let's talk about the implications of the state of disaster for businesses.
Yeah, so thank you for having me firstly. So I think, while load shedding continues, many businesses and especially SMEs are in a very dangerous position. Many of them don't have the means to find costly alternative power solutions, and in many cases those businesses are faced with no other option other than considering shedding jobs, cutting down on production, or perhaps even closing their doors. So I think that the state of disaster has been met with varying responses and reactions, and I'm personally cautiously optimistic about the announcement. I do think that we need to take some extraordinary measures in order to achieve some extraordinary outcomes. But yes, I'm still not convinced that we've learned the lessons completely that we need to learn from the previous declaration of the national state of disaster. So yes, while I do think that the energy crisis deserves to be treated with urgency, I do believe that we need to take a step back and make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. Maybe
let's talk about some of those mistakes.
Yeah, 100%. So things that people are concerned about are the corruption and the mismanagement of funds that happened previously. And, the amounts of money that we're talking about here are not small amounts of money. So, if we don't use the funds correctly and allocate them correctly, there's a huge risk that we're just going to end up getting ourselves into a even more problematic situation than what we currently are in. So, yes, so we do need to look at it very carefully.
Now, the President will appoint a Minister of Electricity who will sit in the Presidency, and as he said earlier on this morning, will literally sit in his office. That, by implication, means that there's a huge amount of oversight that President Cyril Ramaphosa will have on this individual, and hopefully the operations around it. Does this, to some degree, give us a sense of assuredness that the amount of corruption, if any, is likely to be limited to nil?
So I think, corruption happens in every country across the globe. It's not a problem that is limited to South Africa or even Africa. So that oversight doesn't mean that there will not be corruption. I mean, take, for instance, the Steinhoff case. There was a governing body overseeing Steinhoff, and yet things still happened. So, there needs to be proper governance put in place so that it does minimize the effect of it. And I potentially think that reporting of any cases of potential mismanagement funds or procurement irregularities or anything of the sort should be reported directly to that electricity minister, so that Cyril Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa, is aware of everything. It's the only way. That oversight and that close management is the only way that I think that it is going to minimize the effects of corruption.
Well, we're all too familiar with states of disaster. Now, how financially different is this state of disaster for businesses compared to COVID-19 state of disaster, specifically speaking to SMMEs?
So that does yet to be seen. It is yet to be seen. So I think that some of the things that they will probably look at reinstating, or I'm hoping that they'll look at reinstating, is, for instance, the TERS scheme, which helped with temporary relief for wages. So I'm hopeful for that, but I think we're going to have to wait to hear more detail in the finance minister's budget speech on the 22nd of February. But at this point, something has to be done, especially for SMEs, because they really are taking the brunt of of this load shedding that we're currently experiencing. And they're the entities that make up 39% of our country's GDP and make up more than 98% of businesses across the country. So we need to make sure that the contribution from SMEs increase over the coming years and emphasize the importance that they have in our South African economy. But yes, they're the ones that are the most vulnerable to economic disruption. So we need to make sure that they are taken care of, both financially, but also from an assistance perspective that entails more than just finance. A lot of the time, they just need a little bit of guidance themselves.
Okay, well, I'm glad you raised that issue, because President Cyril Ramaphosa had talked about a 10 billion government fund to be established in partnership with the South African SME Fund. Is this 10 billion enough when we talk about the support or how much the SMEs carry the South African economy? Is 10 billion enough, or should it be a little bit more?
I think it depends on how it's used. It's a great start. But again, we're all a little bit nervous about whether the funds will actually be mismanaged or will be managed appropriately. If they are managed appropriately and they're given to, my opinion on it is that the funds should be given to businesses of any size, but that have huge growth potential very quickly. Because the more growth that we can get, the more growth that will be generated. So I think it's a good start, but I do think that SMEs also, besides the funds, giving people or businesses money is not the only solution. They need to be given guidance and advice and foresight, so that they can use those funds to their best advantage and to make the best use of them, for not only for themselves but for the growth of the economy.
You obviously raised some important issues, Michelle, around how will this 10 billion be, certainly, one, administered, and two, how will it be drawn down by the SMEs. But it also raises the question, since time immemorial, that SMMEs have talked about, and that is actual access to the fund and the potential red tape and bureaucracy around accessing these amounts.
100%, but I think that red tape is necessary. There needs to be some sort of due diligence process that is put in place to make sure that the funds are going to the correct SMEs. There was an enormous amount of fraud that happened around this. If we talk about TERS, if we talk about some of the other funds that were implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I understand that there's red tape, and I understand from a business perspective myself. We applied for funding during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I understand the admin and the red tape is incredibly tedious and frustrating at times. But it is also incredibly important to make sure that the correct due diligence is done to make sure that the funds are appropriately allocated. It is unfortunately a process that I think is necessary.
How long was that process for you, in your own experience?
It depended on the fund. So I've got a group of companies that I am financial director of, and I spent much of the lockdown, the hard lockdown, in the March, April, applying for funds. And we were very lucky. We have all of the right things in place. I make sure we run a very tight ship. So it was just a case of putting the documents together more than anything, and justifying what needed to be justified. So depending on the fund, I'd say anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days per application.
Okay, so the bureaucracy and red tape is not an elongated process that will see a business sinking when it needs support.
100%, but I do need to emphasize that people need to make sure that they are completely compliant with everything that they need to be. So they need to make sure that they have access to be able to get their bank statements. They have access to be able to get their subsidy documents. They have access to yeah, all of those sorts of things. So make sure that everything is up to date in advance, because if you don't, those are going to be stumbling blocks and hurdles that are in your way. So a bit of advice from a business perspective is make sure that everything is up to date. Make sure that you're legally compliant. Make sure that all of your taxes are paid and you've submitted your returns on time, because those are the kind of things that they're going to be looking for in the application process.
Michelle Austin, appreciate your time. Economist, for giving us her
much.
reaction to the state of the nation address.